I did a poll some time ago on Facebook. The poll, I asked pastors specifically, have you given a sermon on abortion? And I don't think I got one who said, like, yes, I've given a Sunday service. No, most of them said, oh, well, we talk about it, we mention it. So as pastor teachers that we are, I was shocked because it reflects bad on myself as well, because I call myself a teacher. But obviously, this is a topic that I think we should at least do a couple, if not a series, of sermons during the year. I mean, there's 12 months. Sunday services are there 52, 50 something. Anyway, the point is that I ask questions like that because I'm also analyzing myself. What are we doing about it? So I call this Calling Evil Good, Selling Abortion in the USA. So first, I want to talk about the mission, the purpose for my talk today. There's an old saying some have heard, as the pulpit goes, so goes the church. The mission today is to look at why the pulpit has gone, basically from this topic, why it's MIA, missing in action. So I want to try today to approach it from a couple of points of why pastors in general might feel that this is not a good topic to speak on a Sunday morning. First of all, it's too political. And by that, nowadays, people hear conservative. So if you're a church or you call yourself a church or a Christian, especially a pastor, people immediately go to conservatism. And then they go to their little party tribes, their little partisan lines, right? Another reason why it's too complex an issue. We're not informed enough. It deals with matters related to, obviously, the medical world, science, things that the church really are known to reject, especially science. You know, that's the old traditional line that pastors are not scientific. They don't believe in science. And by science, they mean evolution. You know, not just normal science, general science that we obviously all believe in, but like gravity, E equals mc squared and things like that. And lastly, the most important reason why pastors are MIA is because you're going to offend your church, specifically the women in your group. You have probably heard it said, I'll do a Jesus here, you probably have heard it said, you're not a woman, you can't possibly know. But it's a well-known tactic, right? That the woman is my body, it's my choice, and especially a man shouldn't talk about this. You shouldn't infringe on my choice as a woman because you're not a woman. So I'm going to deal first with the political. So first, though, I'd like to approach the political section with a disclaimer. This is my apolitical disclaimer. So most of you know that I'm against participating or promoting certain things to do with the so-called political, military, industrial complex. So obviously, it doesn't mean that for me personally, I cannot dissent in certain extraordinary situations, and that the Christian in general cannot dissent if the matter is political. So you have these, a couple of stories we always talk about, Daniel 3, the 3 young men who refused to heed the government, at that time, the government commandment to bow down. So that's in Daniel 3. And of course, in the New Testament, you have the story of the apostles in Acts chapters 4 and 5, where remember they come to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, by the way, was a political wing of the Roman Empire. So for example, remember that Pilate keeps sending Jesus to the Jews? Because Pilate and the Sanhedrin had a relationship. So they took care of certain things. So you have the story in Acts 4 and 5 where the apostles, remember, I think they're taken by force to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin says, stop doing what you're doing, remember? So basically that's the government, that's the state. And they, remember what the response was? They said, we're not going to listen to men. We're going to listen to God. So these are exceptional situations, right? Where the church, the apostles representing the church, say to the state, no. And that goes against the, for example, commandments of Romans 13, where Paul says, submit to the authorities of the land, right? But obviously, there are exceptions to that rule. We don't always submit, and we sometimes dissent. So the fact is that not so long ago, I would say about 50 years ago, morality itself became politicized. So for example, in recent years, we have seen state-sponsored attacks on marriage, the family, and even sexual gender. Remember in Peru, the families told us they didn't want to send their young children, 7-year-olds, to public school because the teachers there, or the school system, was into basically gender confusion, but yes, just already children as young as 7 and 8 in this Peru, South America. So this is a fact, and in this country since 1973, we have been witness to a systematic Holocaust-level war on unborn children. So as a student of history, I can tell you that this has never happened before. This sort of state-sponsored, state-backed assault on moral institutions like family, marriage, and abortion has never happened. Think about that. If you know a little bit of history, there have been some very wicked systems, empires, not just a government in one little piece of land, but we're talking covering mass territories. One that comes to mind is the biggest in terms of territorial domain. The biggest one was the Mongol Empire, right, of the famous, infamous Genghis Khan and his later Khans. And that was a wicked, wicked atheist empire, by the way. These people just, they were infamous for raising cultures, exterminating cultures. And then they were stopped at the famous battle in Europe near the Balkans. So these are indeed extraordinary times we are witness to. So even though, again, I hold to a more stringent, if you will, separation of church and state by preaching New Testament non-lethal violence and being personally against any political military involvement, I believe we must always preach nonetheless against immorality, whether it has been politicized or not. So that's my apolitical disclaimer. Now let's look at is it too complex? Are we too uninformed? Well, I'd like to show you what I call the Orwellian campaign strategy that has befallen this country and convinced many well-to-do Christians, well-meaning sincere Christians, that abortion in some cases is okay. Just to be clear, I do not condone abortion in any case. I feel we should do whatever is possible to save the child. So the infamous Republican stance, the conservative stance of, well, in cases of, incest and rape, it's okay. I think that's part of their platform. No, that's not okay. I mean, you're killing a human being, and we'll see. I mean, I must say that as a child of the 70s and 80s, I grew up never having to deal with this question until I really came to the U.S. I moved here in 2010. But growing up, I knew as a child that what's in the womb, in the belly of the woman is us. It's a human being. There's so it baffles me that the so-called millennium, is that what they're called? The millennial age people, and we have to convince the young people that it's a human being in the womb. Why? Because of this Orwellian style campaign. So what do I mean by that? If you read the book, George Orwell's 1984, there's a famous quote there: control the language, control the masses.
Yes.
So that's key, and that's also key as a theology. When we control the language of theology, we change the meaning of certain words. That's it, you got them. You got most people, unfortunately, pro-choice, right? You've heard that, well, most of us by now. Pro-choice, right to choose. It's the right of the woman to choose. pro-women. Yes, we're for women. I'm for men. I'm for children. I'm for dogs, for cats, for all living beings. It's a basic health service. It's a productive health rights issue. Now, what word there is key in those two? Health. It's about her health. So how dare you, especially as a man, you don't know anything. You don't know about labor pains and what's in my belly. Sorry, I'm being facetious. Health is the key. Restricting access to women. And then we get to what's inside the womb. It's a fetus, not a baby. And we get to the actual killing of the baby, which is now called ending a pregnancy. And this whole thing is called a procedure. That's an interesting quote. So it's too black and white. The issue is not black and white. It's gray. There's a gray area. So we have to present this as too complicated to be black and white. That's an interesting use of language. And these are obviously educated people, college educated people. They're politicians, lawyers, they're doctors buying into the campaign strategy. They're some of the smartest people we have that are strategizing against the, let's call them more simple-minded among us or uneducated among us. Hosea 12, Genesis 25. So I want us to go into the scriptures. So I want to see from scripture, if scripture helps us, and hopefully it'll help you, to see what is in the womb. Is it a what or a who? It's like the Trinity, right? Definitely clear that what's in the womb are human beings, and sometimes incredible human beings, prophets of God. I love the Job one. I love where he goes into detail of how God formed him, the sinew and the skin and the bone, right? So what does that tell us about destroying that in the womb? So if God is knitting, is that the word? Knitting together like a fabric, our person, what does that say when violence comes upon that person? That God is almost, it's like God like doing it, right? Like knitting it together like fabric. And when we see ourselves, when you see your hands, for example, you see the intricate nature of it. And to think that God, in an invisible, supernatural way, really, all life is supernatural. We can't just reproduce life. So it's still a sort of magical, if I can use that word in a positive sense, action, life. It's a sacred moment when the babies were being created by the hand of God himself almost. That's the picture I'm getting. Luke 1. Now we'll look at the greatest two individuals in the history of humanity. By the way, who were they?
Jesus and John.
Right. That was a trick question. This account of Luke 1 is fascinating when it comes to his topic. It's witnessed by a medical doctor. So according to Paul in Colossians 4, remember he mentions Luke the doctor, and many scholars think that might be the Luke that wrote this account and the account of Acts. So it's witnessed by a medical doctor and a historian. Like God saying to us, hello, wake up. Now what's interesting in this account is that the Greek reveals an interesting aspect of this discussion, because the baby described in the womb, the Greek is brephos, which is, so that's in verses 41 and 44 of Luke 1, and it's also used in the Luke 2 account in verse 12 and verse 16. The interesting thing is that it's the same Greek word to describe what's in the womb, before and after birth. So in Luke 2, verse 12 and 16, it's the same word, brephos, the baby that is wrapped in clothes or swaddling clothes, and verse 16, the baby that's lying. It's the same word. Isn't that interesting? So a pregnancy, folks, this is the birds and the bees, equals a baby, a human being, both before and after you're born. That's quite telling in the account. Reverend Stanley Yaki, who made an interesting observation about the birth of these two men. Catholics put us to shame on this issue. They put Protestants definitely to shame when it comes to the abortion issue. Il Papa, the Pope, puts the whole Christianity to shame by his continued stance to protect the life of us in the womb. That again, if any of these individuals had been born under this current government, again, this is unprecedented what we're living through. I love how we look at technology and I'm sitting, I always say, in a palace in an incredible environment here, especially considering our mission work that we do, where that takes us. But this is truly amazing. I got it. I mean, can you imagine iPads, Anthony, back in the 50s? You barely had a radio. It's incredible. So we have sort of been lulled into a sense of how great are we? How great is society? How we're, there's this kingdom now thing. How great the kingdom is spreading, and we're advancing and evolving, and actually, by the way, maybe the kingdom is here. And we're building the kingdom, and what's the language? Spreading the kingdom. But underneath the nicely mowed grass and the nicely green pastures of society, especially Western society, in the undergrowth, there's an unprecedented level of wickedness and evil being perpetrated like no other time in the history of the world, because now the government is behind it. It used to be just people, just certain groups, but now governments. That's very dangerous, and that's how this whole ball of string, that's how it's all going to come undone, and Scripture has to be fulfilled. The prophecy has to be fulfilled. Man will wax worse, right? The famous King James. That's how it's going to come down. And Scripture will be proven right, because Scripture says, how great is this? Gay old time. It's so good, right? Everyone's saying peace and joy. Remember that Scripture? And suddenly, like the flood, it all comes crashing down. What does the Bible say about calling evil good? Because that's basically what we're looking at. Now, I'm using some paraphrases on your screen there. How horrible it will be for those who call evil good and good evil, who turn darkness into light and light into darkness, who turn what is bitter into something sweet and what is sweet into something bitter. And then Malachi 2:17. Someone asked about protest and activism. So should we put on our, yellow vests? Again, as an apolitical pastor, teacher, it's difficult. Don't you believe me? I wish I was there in the front lines. Just like I wish I did a lot of things that the Bible tells me not to do. Like when I'm smacked on the right cheek, right? It takes more courage not to go out there with a sickle and pitchforks and lit torches. It takes more courage to just do what the prophets say here. Look at, are the prophets protesting the state? In this case, if Isaiah, Habakkuk, King David himself were living, would they be protesting, especially violently, against the state that is backing abortion? I don't think so. Who are they protesting? I hope that I have given you some food for thought, that it's not too political. So see my disclaimer. It's really not a complex issue. Like I said, I can only speak for myself growing up. Only in my, was it 30s, late 20s did I start hearing about the baby not being, we don't really know when life begins, and when the baby draws the first, to me, it's just, I was an agnostic. You have had to convince me as an agnostic that it wasn't, first of all, a baby, let alone a life in the womb. As an agnostic, I wasn't even a Christian, folks. So it's just boggles my mind. So it's not complex, I believe. I have hopefully given you some biblical information there. So note the strategies. So we're not uninformed, pro-women, pro-health, all key words. And about offending people in your church. Now remember, we judge not to damnation, not to the lake of fire, but we judge in reference to discernment among ourselves, especially the pastor teacher. You have to judge. Again, not to condemnation, but in discernment. Yeah. Don't just sit there like a log, as they say, but judge everything you're hearing and everything you're being taught. So you're judging me right now, and I'm perfectly fine by that. Then I'll finish with the offending church members, especially women. Now I'll give you an example from Jesus, and of course we can say, but we're not Jesus. But obviously Jesus, what he said, what he did, can inform us. Yes, I'm not Jesus. I'm not gonna get a whip or create a whip and start chasing people out of wherever, but we can learn from this story. In Luke 11, it's a very fascinating story because Jesus is invited by a Pharisee to his house. That's interesting, right? Because Pharisees are always getting at Jesus, but this guy was actually hospitable. And from what happens next, it wasn't a sort of catch-22. It wasn't like the Pharisee invited Jesus so we can get him in something. I don't think so. I think what happens as we read this account is a result of just Jesus accepting an invitation from, I think, a well-meaning Pharisee. But then very quickly, I think even before Jesus goes into the guy's house, Jesus starts rebuking the ceremonial purification rites of the old covenant, of the old law, under the old law.
Yes.
And he starts rebuking that. As a Jew, by the way, there's a series of woes. Jesus just lays on this. He lays the smack, as they say in wrestling. He totally goes at these people, and he starts a series of woes, and I counted almost 10 woes. So one of the teachers of the law, after Jesus starts with the woes, he says to Jesus something interesting. So you have two groups, the Pharisees there and teachers, scribes. So there's two separate groups within Judaism. And one of the teachers, not the Pharisees, says to Jesus, hey, teacher, he says, when you say these cruel things about them, the Pharisees, you're insulting us too. And then Jesus continues in verse 48. This is a kingdom situation, isn't it, folks? Can you imagine a situation we could find ourselves in where we have the ability to open the door, but we don't go in and we don't allow others to go in? I must say, though, I usually see women. I don't know about you guys out there, but I see women spokespersons. They're at the front of this stuff, abortion. Women. Recently, someone adopted a child. The story of the adoption was that the mother had decided beforehand to give away the child, her child. And this is in the USA, not in Lima, Peru, not in Managua, Nicaragua, where it's very tough. In other words, it's not a third world country, but a mother, a woman somewhere, had already decided before giving birth to give away her child. So I must say that it looks to me like women have a lot to answer for. I'm sorry, but they're out there. They're putting themselves out there as the leaders of abortion movements and giving away your child before it's even born. Now, obviously, I'm glad that the women who decide to do that instead of the alternative, which is probably abortion, yes, I commend you for it. But as a man, I think, how can you as a woman, how does that happen where you get to a point where you have deceived yourself that it's not your baby and you can pretty much do whatever with it you want out of convenience? In this country, it's out of convenience, folks. No one's dying of hunger in this country. Very few, very few. Of course, there are extra, I don't mean to sound, but you know what I'm saying? Like, as a man, I can't understand. Incredible to me, so.